that this year at North Idaho College, all of the Popcorn Forum activities will be held in Boswell Auditorium. So, Schuler Auditorium here in Boswell Hall. So, at 1 o'clock today, we will have a debate between our two guests, and that will be followed at 2:30 by a panel discussion. It's quite a privilege to be talking about a city of the greatest antiquity today, Beijing. But before I talk about Beijing and introduce our two guests today, I first want to give our thanks to three entities that make the Popcorn Forum possible. I'd like to thank the Idaho Council for the Humanities, the North Idaho College Foundation, and the Associated Students of North Idaho College. I'd also be remiss if I did not mention a very important name in all this, and that name is Tony Stewart, who Tony, as you may know, created the Popcorn Forum, and through his endless efforts and wellspring of enthusiasm has made the Popcorn Forum a success every year, and I think this year will be a tremendous success as well. Beijing has gone by many different names. Probably the oldest, for sure, records we have of a city existing on the site of Beijing dates back to about 1000 BC. By 500 BC, we find it to be a thriving metropolis. And so, please buckle your seat belts. Not only are we going to go across the Pacific, across the China Sea, but we're also going to venture back to that time of 500 BC. And when we get to Beijing, we should find a thriving center of commerce, of trade, but anywhere that we would look in Beijing, we would not see our two guests today, Confucius and Buddha, although they were alive at the time. Their profound impact on Beijing was to come later. For Confucius, about 300 years later, and for Buddha, about 700 years later. But nonetheless, Beijing is the city that they're going to have a profound influence upon. And we look at the first names of this city, and we find it being called Ji, later Yanjing. And when it became the northern capital of that part of China by the Jin Kingdom, it was called Zhongdu. And it was under this name of Zhongdu that Genghis Khan found when he invaded China and in 1215 overthrew the Chinese and established all of China, united all of China under Mongol rule. In 1279, though, it was not Genghis Khan but his grandson, Kublai Khan, who made Beijing his capital and changed the name to Daidu. Now, as you can imagine, an empire that went from the Korean Peninsula all the way to Hungary, from east to west, and from southeast China in the south, all the way to Siberia in the north, the greatest landmass that has ever been under military occupation. And many of these armies would plunder and bring the booty back to Daidu, the current site of Beijing. So you can imagine the opulence that was to be found there. And of course, this is what Marco Polo found when he traveled to Daidu and visited the imperial palace of Kublai Khan. Unfortunately, none of that palace remains now. There are no ruins. However, we have the writings of Marco Polo to know that it had to be a very extraordinary place indeed. Remarkably, Daidu was a place of religious freedom. People had the freedom to practice the religion that they wanted to. Unfortunately, of course, it was not a place of great political freedom. After the death of Kublai Khan, the Mongol Empire crumbled, and in 1369, the Ming Dynasty came to power, and it was the son of the great general of the Ming Dynasty who overthrew the Mongol rule, Yang Li, who made Beijing his capital and gave it the name Beijing, which means northern capital. And it's remained Beijing since that time. It has usually been the capital of Japan, but not always. Sometimes Nanking has been. But as we know today, as a communist seat of government, it definitely is the capital of China in some very, very important ways. As you can imagine, China, being a very big country, should have, you might guess, 3 different time zones. However, that's not the case. Every place in China sets its clocks to Beijing. That's how important Beijing is to China. And so the influence that Beijing received from the great thinkers of the past is very, very important. It is said that to understand Chinese thought, you must understand 3 great thinkers of the past, and 2 of them are with us today. The one who's not, Lao Tzu, noted as the father of Taoism, had a very strong influence. Confucius, however, had an even more profound influence. And I'm going to introduce Confucius first today. Even though he's 12 years younger, was 12 years younger than Buddha, his influence was felt so much earlier in Beijing, I thought it fitting to introduce Confucius. Now, before I do, I want to make a point. Confucius today is portrayed by Dr. Aloysius Chang of Washington State University. Dr. Chang is a professor of foreign languages there, and he's well versed also in Chinese history, philosophy, and religion. Very fitted to portraying the role of Confucius. But out of reference to Confucius, Dr. Chang did not want to dress or try to appear like Confucius. And this is an important point. It lets you know, for one thing, the reverence that the Chinese hold Confucius, the great master, under. And it also, I think, speaks of Dr. Chang's character, his integrity, and his reverence for the great master. So without further ado, will you please give a warm welcome to Confucius.
你们好. How are you? And before I start, I would like just to very briefly say 2 words about the city of Beijing. Maybe some of you would like to go and visit the place. Number 1, the name Beijing in Chinese composed of 2 characters. Beijing, Bei meaning north, Jing meaning capital. So it is the capital of China now. Right now, my dear friend, just briefly give you the rundown of in China will be divided, like here in the United States, we have 50 states and the District of Columbia. Now in China, we divided into number 1, there are exactly 23 provinces. And then after that, you have, outside the 23 provinces, you have 5 autonomous regions. And after that, you have 4 independent cities. One of them is Beijing. And the number 4, there's 1 unit, which is just added last year on July the 1st, 1997. I think all you know that. Now it's called the self-sustaining place called Hong Kong, Shanghai. Now, without any further delay, let me try to introduce myself. My name is Kongzi. In Chinese, Kongqiu. In English, you call Confucius. And this word, Confucius, is from Latin, called Confucius. If some of you cannot remember the name Confucius, you just remember the confusion. Of course, this is nothing to do with that one, because in Chinese, Kongzi, Kong should be Kongzi, Kongzi. Now in China, all the words, like we told the scholar at that time, we called after the family name, these are words, Kongzi, like Kongzi, Laozi, Xunzi, all the zi, okay? Although I got to be careful, my dear friend, because the same character zi in Chinese, in Japanese, it pronounced ko. Now, quite a few of the Japanese females, ladies and girls, all their first name ending quite a few. According to percentage, probably almost 90% of the Japanese first names are in the same code, the same zi. So therefore, sometimes very interesting to see the Chinese word 孔子. Somebody thought must be a Japanese lady. No, which is nothing to do. Now, I was born in the year 551 before Christ. Now, my dear friend, you ask me, how do you know? How do you know you were born that year? I don't know. At least that was my... For the answer, I would just quote Chesterton. Somebody asked, when you were born, you know? He said, my mother told me. That's very, very good. So I don't know I was born or not on that year, but at least my mother told me I was born in the year 551 BC, before Christ. Talking about that one, my dear friend, let me just inject to you one thing, which I have heard quite a few times before in a discussion. I myself, I was educated in the Christian university. Quite a few European Christian professors said, you guys, you have to cry. Why? Because your great Saint Confucius is not in paradise, is not in heaven, he's in hell. Why? The reason was he was not a Christian. He was not a Catholic. Just imagine, my dear friend, I was born 551 years before Christ. How can I be a Christian? My family was very poor. Until I was 15 years old, I had some private training at home. And after 15, I went to a private institution where I started to learn some of the basic arts. When I was 30 years old, I started to kind of go into some professional, try to get some disciples, try to get some establishment. However, at that time, I'm still, financially, I was not kind of competent to take any kind of job. Therefore, I received some kind of job in the local government. And I transferred a couple times. And until I was almost 50 years old, I thought that was not my life. So my life was to try to dedicate my life to some learning, some scholar academic investigation studies. So therefore, I started to gather disciples. I started to get some followers who are interested to learn the great tradition of China. The great, if you ask me how many are there, I had in the very beginning, probably around about in the thousands. Roughly speaking, probably around 2,000 disciples. But among the 2,000 disciples, there are about 72 or 73. They are rather well-known ones. So they carried my teaching. They also spread my philosophy. They also carried on my so-called literary tradition. There's only one thing, my dear friend, I'd like to point out is this one. I myself, although I have been classified by the later on, even the contemporary Western philosophers, Western historians, as a Chinese philosopher, as a Chinese thinker. But par excellence, for the number one, I'm a man of ethical teaching, of religious mind, okay? And probably this will characterize the so-called myself. And finally, during my late years, and also I cared to teach, stay in the center, with my disciples until the end, your year almost 479. I passed away. In my year, 73 years old. My whole life, my dear friend, I was looking for the truth. The truth. I read in the book of Analects, if you want to see that one, there's one line that's very important. I will use that one as the conclusion of my life. If I find truth, if I find God in the morning, I'm ready to die in the evening. Thank you.
I'd like to next introduce Buddha, who is portrayed by Dr. Michael Myers from Washington State University as well. And he's an associate professor of philosophy. His specialty is Eastern philosophy, so that's very fitting. He has studied Buddhism for many, many years, as well as Confucianism. And unlike Confucius, who was born in China, our guest Buddha was never to step foot in China. Yet we find that the teachings of Buddha had a very, very profound impact indeed, and still do in modern-day China. Without further ado, will you please welcome Buddha.
Namaste. Good morning. Namaste is the traditional greeting of northern India, and I was born in northern India. Before I tell you a little bit about my life, let me talk a little bit about dates. Traditionally, the date of my birth was given as 563 before Christ. But in the last decade or so, there has been some controversy about that. Indians have never been very good at keeping historical dates. And some scholars now are saying that my birth date is 485 BC. Somewhere around there, I was born. My name is Siddhartha Gautama. Gautama is my family name, and Siddhartha is my given name. Siddhartha is a word, it's one of those names, that you have to kind of grow into. Siddha, the first part of Siddhartha, means achievement. And artha, the last part, means for the purpose of. So my name basically means for the purpose of achievement. So I was expected to be a high achiever. Unlike my friend Confucius, I was born in a rich family. What was it that I was supposed to achieve? Well, what I had planned and what my parents had planned were two different things. My parents expected me to become a prince, to become versed in the arts of war and also of farming. We come from a farming family in northern India. But I was of a sensitive nature as a child, and I didn't want to become a prince. And to give you a little bit of the story of my life, I'll tell you one of the legendary stories of how I decided not to be a prince and how I entered the life of a mendicant or a wandering beggar. It was when I was about 4 years old and I had broken my leg, and it was spring, and I was not able to walk for the whole summer. It was very difficult for a child of that age to have to put up with that. I was looking out into the fields where my father farmed, and I noticed that there were birds and they were eating the worms. And then I noticed a hunter, and he shot one of the birds for his dinner. And it struck me at that age that life is a kind of cycle. The birds eat the worms, the hunters eat the birds, And who knows who eats the hunter in northern India. So that was one thing that led to my contemplative kind of nature. I was always able to kind of go into a mood of meditation or contemplation very easily. But what really sparked my destiny in life was when I was in my late 20s and I finally traveled a bit. I went outside the palace grounds in a carriage and I saw the world. I saw a very sick person at the side of the road. I saw a dead person being prepared for cremation. And as you may know, in India, funeral and cremation is a more public sort of activity than it is in the United States. I also saw a number of elderly people. And these facts penetrated into my mind. Sickness, death, old age. And I thought to myself, what is the meaning of this process of life that we live? Will I be able to find out what it means by living the worldly life? I decided the answer to that question was no. I decided the only way that I could possibly find even the problem of life, let alone the answer, was to set out and seek, according to the spiritual quest that was a part of my society and still is a part of my society today. In other words, it's a kind of okay job or vocation in India to make such a spiritual quest. So that's what I did. I studied under a couple of very famous teachers who taught me a lot about meditation. They taught me austerities. One austerity was to keep the tongue up against the roof of my mouth very tightly. Another was to clench my teeth. My dentist didn't like that when he heard about it. And I fasted a lot. I almost died from lack of nutrition. I decided, after living a luxurious life as a young prince and suffering austerities as a 20-something, that a middle path would have to be the path that I would take, somewhere between the path on the one hand of austerity and the path on the other hand of luxury. So I set out on my own. I began to eat again. And my teachers thought I was lost to luxury. They gave me up. I was on my own. I sat under a tree and determined to myself not to leave until I had at least figured out the problem, if not the solution, to life. And I was able to figure it out. I figured out that the things that we undergo in life, suffering, if you will, suffering in the sense not just of feeling pain, but suffering of undergoing things, has a cause. I determined what the cause was, and then I determined that once we know the cause, we can take care of the cause. And later in the day, if you have time, we could perhaps share some of these things. After I reached my nirvana, which was the wisdom I gained at that time, I taught. And now I'm getting near 80, and perhaps I'll pass out of this existence soon, never to return again. Thank you.
Well, thank you both, Confucius and Buddha, for introducing yourselves and a little bit about your philosophies. In all of the cities we will look at this week, we find that each one of these historic cities had some kind of moral dilemma, if maybe one, maybe several, major moral dilemmas that they struggled with. And for the city of Beijing, one of the things that comes to mind in trying to, the Western mind trying to understand what happened in 1989 in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, it's a mystery to us. But in understanding these moral dilemmas, perhaps we can understand a little bit better some recent occurrences that have happened. For many, many years in China, there has been a struggle, a moral dilemma between the individual versus the collective society. And the way they have resolved the issue in China is significantly different than some of the solutions that we have reached to that moral dilemma here in the United States. Should the individual sacrifice their own dreams, their own goals, in order to achieve what's right for the greater number, for the state, so the individual versus the state? That is the issue that we struggle with. And Beijing has struggled with, and with almost, from the Western mind, competing philosophies from Confucius and from Buddha. How could one person ever accept both? And yet, that's what we find in today's China. Many people accept both Buddha and Confucius, individual versus the state. It seems a paradox. Let's find out how our two guests today feel about these issues. We'll start with Confucius. Would you please address that issue and tell us how it ties into your overall teachings?
The very essential difference between the Oriental philosophy and the Chinese philosophy and the so-called Western philosophy is this point. Because in the Western philosophy, we stress very much in the so-called like the individual, the right. We start with that one. While in the Confucian philosophy, in the Confucian ethics, if you want, and there the basic idea is not individual. Is what? Is collectiveness, is a group, is the family, is the state. So therefore, the I, the word I, is used, yes, but rather than use a, we use we. For instance, if the teacher, a parent, try to tell the student, try to tell the little boy, try to behave. Usually says behave, not to be you. He said in order not to harm, not to hurt the name of the family, the name of the group. So that is why I would like, since I studied during the past quite a few years, I studied the Western philosophy, which I liked very much. But I do see the basic, essential difference between the Western philosophy and the Chinese philosophy. Now, because the basic idea of the Chinese philosophy, which mostly come back from my philosophy, from the Confucian philosophy, are the so-called collectiveness, the society. All right. Now, in order to say that one, if you see, in my philosophy there, the basic idea, for instance, to give this what, is the idea of ren. Ren. For the word ren, it's the traditional Chinese scholar, they try to use that word J-E-N. But quite in the United States, we try to use the word R-E-N, ren. Okay? But in Chinese, it is pronounced ren. Ren meaning what? It's a very difficult to translate the meaning of the ren. Some would say love. Some would mean understanding. Some meaning benevolence. Okay? It doesn't matter. Simply ren by itself is nothing else is but the root of the so-called Chinese philosophy. Means to be part of that community. Is to know my position, is precisely not to know my position, but not to my rights, but rather to know my obligations. Here again, my dear friend, you see the difference between the Western philosophy and the so-called Confucian and Eastern philosophy. Namely, here in the West, we said individual. Consequently, you have the rights. But there, we said the common man and we, consequently, you also have your obligations. You think you have to pay to the society. I mean, both are right, both are beautiful, both are nice. But I just say where are the point of departure, where is the so-called very important to understand. And the next one is here, when I say the word ren, the ren is very difficult to translate again, my dear friend. You asked me the ren. Is the ren something connected with it? To whom? Is it on yourself, starting with yourself? And rather, in the Oriental Confucian philosophy, rather you see this one, you yourself, not only as you, but rather your relation to outside. Therefore, in the so-called, if you're using the Latin word, not the words in, means in, within, but ad, goes out onto to somebody else. So therefore, as an individual, I see, in the Chinese side, you don't see an individual as such, as something isolated, in isolation, but rather than is a part of the family. I personally see, for instance, I see I myself not only as a man, but I see also myself as a husband. I see myself as a father to my children. And also, I see myself as a citizen to the state. I see myself to be a member to my friend. So that is why in my philosophy here, I stress very much on the so-called 五伦. 五伦. 五 in Chinese meaning 5. 伦 meaning kind of relations, connections, ethical connections. Therefore, you ask me, what are those 5 五伦? It's nothing else. Number 1 is a Jun Chen, is the emperor and his subject. Now we use the president and all the citizens if you want. Number 2 is the so-called Fu Zi. Fu, F-U, Zi, Z-I. Fu meaning father, and Zi meaning son. Not only son, but also meaning father and mother, son and daughters. No problem. And the next one, you have so-called Fufu. Fufu. In English, although it's a Fufu, F-U, F-U, but in Chinese, the Fu is one Chinese character, which means husband. The second one also pronounced Fu, which means wife. So here means the relation between husband and wife. And then number 4, you see the relation also becomes a 兄弟. 兄弟, the elder brother and the younger brother. Therefore, the elder sister and the younger sister. Therefore, between brothers and sisters. And then finally, number 5 is a so-called relation between 朋友. 朋友, P-E-N-G-U-Y-O-U. 朋友. 朋友 in Chinese meaning friends. Okay? So therefore, this kind of relation between the emperor and the subject, and the father and son, and husband and wife, and brothers and sisters, and also between friends, these are so-called basic relations in philosophy. You know yourself. Not only you know your own kind of rights, but at the same time you know your obligation. What my obligation to the state, my obligation to my parents, my obligation to my brothers, my obligation to my wife, my obligation to my friends. So in this case, you see a total person. I mean a social being. Okay. Now this one, I know, my dear friend, is for you to understand that one. I know there is certain take a little bit kind of understanding the other side, which is the same thing. Since I am acquainted with both the Eastern philosophy and the Western philosophy, which I also studied quite a few years, I see that where we call our point of departure is different. Because right there, we say individual. But at the same time, in the Chinese individual, yes, but the individual, the we is a social individual, like I'm the part of the community. So that's why he said not only with my rights, but also at the same time with my obligations, with my, you might say, connection in this sense, with all the other part of the group, of the small, the family, and the so-called the city, if you want, and bigger and the larger communities. And finally, we go to the states. Finally, we go to the universe, if you want. So that is number 1. Number 2, I think also you try to understand also, besides to understand the so-called my individuality, which I use the word individual, yes. Do we use in Chinese philosophy, use the word individual? Yes. But rather the individual, yes, not in isolation. It's always in my connection with the so-called outside world, if you want. Immediate with a member of my family, for instance. Now the number two, I would like to insist very much in connection with that one. Namely, do I, so-called individual, what is the end of my, what do I really want? And here, I think in the Western philosophy, we're looking for, I want to do something to reach, in order to reach my end, I use all kind of means. We call them media ad finem, the means towards my end. But since in my philosophy, in the Oriental philosophy, we see the end is there. My obligation to fulfill towards the society, towards my family, and toward my state, and toward my brother, and toward my friends. So therefore, that's immediately my obligation is right there already. Means I have to conscientiously perform these kind of obligations in order to reach that end, which I know already from the very beginning. Now, in connection with this one, I do see the problem. And the problem is that we say that one, can I use any kind of means I want in order to reach that one? The idea, I still want to answer the question yes and no. Yes or no. Because if I want to get that one, to reach my end, to reach my final goal, I have to use a certain means. Now, if this means, in order to reach the goal, we do some kind of inconvenience, we have to harm the other people. Okay? In that case, I should not do that one. Why? Here it comes back again. Since I'm the so-called social being, I have my obligation toward the others. So therefore, I know exactly that is my end. I want to reach the end. I want to reach the goal as soon as possible, with great efficiency if you want. But if in order to reach that one, if I hurt, if I interfere with someone else, I won't do it. So therefore, I see the difference we have between I, my, I, rather than I use the word individuality, rather use the word we. I'm the social being. So the connection with this one, I remember a few years ago, we studied something in my class. I did a comparison between the so-called Oriental philosophy, Confucian philosophy, and so-called Western philosophy. We tried to do this one here. In the Western philosophy, it's very clearly, in order to reach that end, I use this kind of means. Okay? But while on the other side, I said we have the same thing toward the same end. However, here the starting point is not I, but rather the we. So this kind of two very interesting points. And
excuse me, Great Master. We need to give Venerable Buddha a chance to answer the question.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Buddha, how would you answer that question or what would your response be to the moral dilemma of the individual versus the collective whole?
It's a very interesting question, and the location of India at midpoint between the West and China, I think is an analogy to the kind of position that I would have to take on the question of individuality and community. In other words, a kind of midway position. The late 20th century is an odd place to be walking around these days. There are boxes with light and sound that come out of them. And you turn the button and a different image comes on. And last night I was watching this strange box. And these words came out and they said, "Obey your thirst." And I thought, that's very interesting. That's close to one of my teachings. Only my teaching is different in perhaps an important way. My teaching is make your thirst obey you. In India, we do believe in individuality, but we do not believe in individuality to the point of all for myself. That would not be the type of individuality that we would argue for. To obey one's thirst is a very difficult thing if you think about it for a minute. Can you even do it? What is my thirst? Well, I had the young woman pour me tea. You did not. Would you like some? Not everyone can come up right now. We cannot obey our thirst, really. Our thirsts change every day, even every minute. They come and they go. They get stronger. They go this way and that. If we try to obey our thirst, we're in trouble. In fact, the Four Noble Truths, which was a kind of teaching strategy that I developed after attaining nirvana, state that the cause of our predicament is actually thirst. Not thirst in itself, because thirst is a good thing. It tells us when we're thirsty and helps us to rehydrate. But thirst in the sense of the broader kind of craving that we can be involved in. It is only by bringing to an end that kind of craving that we can bring to an end the predicament that we find ourselves in. And that is a kind of individual predicament. My thirst and each one of your thirsts and our panel's thirsts today are all different thirsts. That would be the individual side of things, that we have to deal with that ourselves, and that our life's journey is a journey that sort of belongs to ourselves in an important way. On the other hand, I would not deny community. The primary Buddhist virtue is compassion, karuna. And compassion is a feeling for someone else. It's not a selfish kind of thing. Also, coming from India, our society is based on dharma, which is a concept of duty or religious obligation that we have to one another. That is always a given in Buddhist society and Buddhist philosophy. So I would argue for the individual, the importance of the individual in the individual's search for nirvana, for enlightenment, but I would not want to argue too strongly against a strong community.
Thank you. Throughout Western philosophy, we've argued, we've struggled, we have had trouble concluding any conception of what is the state of human nature. Are we born good? Are we born selfish? Are we born altruistic? Thomas Hobbes said in his legendary Leviathan that we're basically selfish by nature, and every man is at war with every other man. And David Hume argued that we're basically compassionate, we have fellow feeling for each other. In just a few words, could you give us an idea, Confucius, of your conception of that? Is humankind basically evil, basically good? What's your take on that?
The human nature is basically good. However, but our nature itself, because we got that one, we have no choice. You receive that one. So the nature itself is definitely good. However, the outside, the environment, does not make us, you might say, after we changed from our original self. Now that change is not, sometimes we consciously, we know that one, sometimes unconsciously. So therefore, the change of nature from good to evil, and quite a few people do that one. Like in that case, is you are becoming so-called kind of victim of the outside world, of the outside environment. So in that case, strictly speaking, you are not responsible for that one. Yet, we should not say that one too loud about that one, not responsible, although maybe the state police don't quite like it. So, but yes, outside, yes, although we are influenced by outside, the ultimate kind of decision we're making the final, and still rest in ourselves, within ourselves. Now that ourselves, I said again, within ourselves is the ego part, that we are making that one. But back to the very basic point, the nature itself, without any doubt, is good. That's why in the book, I think one of my disciples mentions, said, 人之初，性本善. What's that? In the very beginning of a person, 性, his nature, 本, naturally, 善 is good. So 性本初 is the nature is good from the very beginning. But afterwards, there are kind of changes. Yes.
Thank you, thank you. And Buddha, how would you respond to that?
My teacher once made a statement to me that would lend me to believe that he thought that human nature is basically evil. His statement was this: the world is a hospital. The idea is to check out.
Okay, thank you very much.
But I differ a little bit from my teacher. I think that there might not be an enduring human nature. And therefore, we couldn't really call it good or evil. And that would be my answer.
Thank you. Yes, we have students now that need to go to their 10 o'clock class, so if you have a 10 o'clock class, please take this time to do so. And at this point, we will entertain questions, so please address either Buddha or Confucius, or if you'd like both of them to respond, please do so. Do we have a microphone established? We'll see one.
I think there's one right there.
Oh, could you bring the lights up a little bit, please? Okay, we have microphones down here in front of the stage. So if you'd like to come down and ask a question at this time, please do so. Yes, would you like to come down and speak in front of the microphone, please? It's right here. In the... Your question is important to us.
No, it's... No, I have a question about your original talking about Beijing. Yes. You gave a history of what it was, when it was, and so forth. And when I was in Beijing, it wasn't Beijing, it was Peking.
Yes.
Now, what happened to Peking? You never mentioned it, and you know, I was there for 6 months or so, and it disappeared.
Okay.
Yes, that's a good question.
Okay.
I think I'll let our Chinese language, because it is a language issue, our Chinese language specialist, and I'll let him stick out of character and be Dr. Chong right now. Answer that question for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. Your question is very clear and there at present, Beijing is called Beijing in mainland China, in the place you visit in the People's Republic of China. Beijing is used in the quote-unquote the Republic of China, which is the island of Taiwan. Because Taiwan, as you know, since back to the year in 1947, when Chiang Kai-shek and his army left mainland China, they come to the one to the island of Taiwan. So in Taiwan today, they still politically, they still don't quite recognize the sovereignty of the Beijing government. So maybe in one day, the Chinese government can unite as one. So therefore, the words Beiping, P-I-P-I-N-G, Ping, pronounced Ping, the second tone, is used in Taiwan only. However, my dear friend, if you ask me, where's Beijing, they're in the same place. I tell you, to answer your question, just like the island of Taiwan, in English we call it Formosa. There was one student of mine, he said, sir, I know where Formosa is, but I don't know where Taiwan is. That's the same place. Yeah. So therefore, Beijing and Beiping, exactly the same place. One is used right now in Taiwan. One is used in mainland China. Go ahead. Thank you.
You know, I look at a map now, you know,
yes.
China, and I look for Peking and Tianjin and Qinhuantao,
right.
and there's
Oh,
nothing left, you know, and I can't find out where I was.
Oh, I see. Oh, I see. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Any more questions?
Yes.
Actually, I have two questions. I'm trying to sort out which one's more important or say both. The philosophy, I'm going to call you Confucius because I don't remember your other name, of being for the group doesn't seem too different to me than we in the Western world who are for our family and in some respects for our society, except that we have different rules about how we can go about that. And so I was struck by the similarities, but yet the vast differences that we have. And that's one of my questions about how things are dealt with so differently in China compared to here. My other question is, and it has to do with, well, it's kind of an evolutionary and societal survival question. One is that the individual goes out and fights to survive, and the other one is that collectively people work together to survive. And that there's an argument, I understand, about which is really has occurred over eons. And so I'd like to see you both address these issues.
Confucius, would you like to start?
Yes. Yeah, to answer your question, is there any basic difference between this kind of, between our Western philosophy, Western idea of thinking, of behavior, and Oriental behavior? Strictly speaking, there's not much difference. You are right. Your observation is very good. Since I told you already, I have studied both the Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy. I found exactly the same. However, when we were in the so-called academic world, which I spent so many years in the academic world, in classroom, we are behave like one person. As long as, oh boy, now the class hour is over. Let's go back to the concrete, the real world. So it looks like that's what the problem is. We say that one, are the Western philosophy is different? Is the Western philosophy different from the so-called Confucian Eastern philosophy as such? The answer, yes and no. Yes and no. Yes, I told individual versus the so-called, you might say, the group mentality. However, since both the rights are there, both we try to perform, you see? In that sense, the difference is rather, you might say, almost similar. But I would like to stress one point. Excuse me. Only because the philosophy here, par excellence, in Eastern philosophy, is rather towards the ethics, towards rather than metaphysics. While in the Western philosophy, I study, which most of the time I study cosmology, ontology, and as a forth, as a rather good and so-called in the mental the side. So that's what we're doing. One is behavior, the other is kind of, you might say, thinking, argument, and so forth. So therefore, the departure point is different. Other than that, you are right, completely right. We are great similarities. Okay? Thank you very much.
And Buddha?
Yes, I'm not sure about the answer to the question of biological survival, whether we aim for species being or whether we aim for individual being. That's a very interesting problem. The one thing I could say is that perhaps we aim for both, and the arts of civilization that have grown up have aided us in making progress both as a species and as individuals.
Thank you.
Okay, this is to the man who is portraying Confucius. I was just wondering how or what he would think about first China's takeover of Tibet and now their refusal to let them be free.
By the time, in my time, Confucius' time, there was no such kind of problem. But to answer your question very briefly is this one. With this political problem, Yes, because for the last couple hundred years, as you know, almost over a century. Now, Tibet itself is for the Chinese government, now in Beijing, for instance, I told you already in the very beginning, is one of the 5 so-called autonomous regions. Autonomous region means not has the same status, like it's not the province. So therefore, there's certain kind of autonomy involved. Now, you use the word that China took over Tibet. Is that correct? Well, I think from what I understand, from what the philosophy, from what the history I have studied here, maybe the question should be kind of looking from the historical point of view. Namely, did China using kind of force to grasp Tibet in the first place? Now that one, historically speaking, is not that one. You see? Now at the present, will China leave Tibet alone or not? Now that one, I do not believe I will give you the so-called final answer for that question, because it depends very much on how the government see the so-called autonomy, try to interpret that one. Okay, so that's for the present. The present status of Tibet is still, we call it one of the autonomous region. Okay, autonomous region. So if we can think exactly the same thing, so it's very difficult for us to think without thinking, is that place you call a commonwealth or just? But you will never call that a state. See, for instance, like now, even in our various concrete situation in the state, for instance, like even like the situation of Puerto Rico, is that kind of state. So therefore, the local people try to vote to something like that, and then we see maybe the federal government tries to. Okay. So therefore, for your question, I don't think so. The words China will leave the Tibet, as it is becoming. Maybe. No, who knows? What's in the offer? Okay. Thank you very much.
Buddha would like to ask your question, answer your question too. Is that acceptable?
Yeah, when Mr. Minkler was making the introduction and talking about the city of Beijing, he made the astute observation and the important observation that in China, many people are both Confucian and Buddhist, and that they do not find a problem with being two things. However, one might add as a footnote that Buddhism suffered a number of setbacks in China as it entered China. And Tibet is a Buddhist country. And one of the ways we might look at the problems between Tibet and China is as a problem of the reception of Buddhism in present-day Chinese society.
Thank you. Next question.
As we were listening to you discuss the question of individual versus an individual in relation in a community and the obligations there within, and your approach to perhaps somewhere the middle of the road there between what Western philosophy and Chinese philosophy might stress. One of the things that I notice happening, especially within the United States in the Christian faith, is that we're moving towards, or moving back to, a more collective idea, a more in-relation idea perspective, a stress on the duties, the obligations that we have to those we're in relation with. And yet at the same time, it almost appears as though we're moving into more of a collective I. It's not so much that we're a we, it's a collective I. Whereas my group becomes my individual, and how I interrelate, interact, my obligations to the groups outside of my own becomes a major clashing point. And I'm wondering how your philosophies might avoid, what kind of insights you can have towards us to avoid that kind of a collective individualism.
Is your question to both?
To both of them,
To both of them.
if either of them. It doesn't.
Yeah, this is a very nice question. I like that. If you see what the word says, collective I. Is collective I, is the collective I and we are the same thing or not? You might say, in word, in terminology, I, even there are 5 I's, I. Some people still think this kind of individual involved. However, it's a we here, rather we are in the group. You are right. Still, the we is composed of individual. That's correct. Therefore, I would like to boil down. Women had the same answer. Only you are looking from the other side. I'm looking from the other side. That's what I'm saying. Being a Catholic myself, I think all roads lead to Rome. Whether you go through that way, finally you go to the same place. You see that? So therefore, I think we're talking about the same thing. That's what I'm saying. Since I know both the Western philosophy and the Western philosophy, I see exactly the same thing. So that's why quite a few people ask me, say, "Sir, what kind of people are you? Are you a thinker? Are you a Christian? Are you a Mormon? Are you a specific?" I say, "No, I'm a Catholic. I'm everything." Because Catholics meaning everything. I embrace everything. So therefore, I agree with you. It's true. Philosophical, yes. I like to do that. I like to, excuse me to use the word. In philosophy, I wasted quite a few years making distinctions. In this sense, yes. In that sense, no. The point A should divide into 3 points. In 3 points, again, divide into 4. Yeah, we waste a lot of time on that. But to boil down, we're talking about the same thing. You see? It's the same conclusion. Therefore, you might look at the individual in isolation. But on the other hand, we say those 5 I's, sure, that's the same thing. Okay? So therefore, in philosophy, yes, we have some very clear distinction. I like that. In metaphysics. You can go on. Maybe...
Yeah, I'd like to congratulate you on making that distinction between the collective I and the we. I think that's a very valuable distinction. Mm-hmm. And I think that by discussing individuality and community, we move beyond the simple collective I. Confucianism, for example, has the 5 relations, which Confucius told us about, and that's a much more sophisticated dynamic of the group than we're used to speaking about, I think, in America. So we can use these resources. I would agree that we can use the resources of the different traditions to help us get past that problem of the collective I.
Mr. Mingus, we have time for 2 more questions. There's 2 people here, and then I'm sure you'll tell them about coming back with that.
I certainly will. Two more questions. Wait.
Yes. Is it possible to have a strong society made up of weak individuals? And assuming that it isn't, do we build a strong society primarily by building strong individuals, or is there an alternative?
Is your question for both gentlemen?
Oh, wait.
Yes.
I think that definitely we need to build a society of strong individuals. And I think that we have always tried to do that. I think China has tried to do that. India has tried to do that. All societies have tried to do that. I think America has succeeded greatly up to this point in its system of public education in building a society of strong individuals. But I think that's in some danger. I think that if we determine a kind of new class elitism, a new class structure in which only certain people by virtue of wealth or class can attain to higher education, then we're in trouble. But I think that the way a society of strong individuals is engendered is by education. So that would be my answer.
Thank you. Yes. I just add one more point. Can the so-called individual kind of help the part in the group? Without any doubt, if the individual has great determination, if you want to do something, that's already, we call that half of the way. Just like if a good citizen, if a good student already determined to study, determined to make a good grade, that's already half of the way and have already accomplished. So in this sense, yes. To answer the question, I think I would rather look at the question positively. My answer is yes. To the question, if someone has the will, like to perform that one, like to reach that goal, that's already there. So therefore, if you ask me, that's why I remember when I was studying philosophy, exactly the same question I asked before. Who is perfect? What's a perfect person? Can I say I'm 100% perfect? No. As long as I'm determined to be perfect, I want to make the first step, that's already make the sign. That's right. In that case, I'm already, you might say, on the way towards perfection. Thank you very much.
Okay, and our last question, please.
I was wondering if either of these philosophers believed in a set moral standard, or if they believed in any form of supernatural force or deity to which human beings were accountable in societies.
Who'd like to start with that one?
I'll begin. Certainly, Buddhism has a very developed set of moral standards. The beginning of the Buddhist ethics was given in the Eightfold Path, which is a system of a pathway of 8 different things one should do, which would include having right speech, right thought, doing rightly, working at an honorable profession, and then having the correct Buddhist practice, which would include meditation, I think, and that would be analogous to prayer in Christianity. No, the Buddha was silent. That's the first, well, okay. Then there's also a very developed set of moral rules for the monks and the nuns called the Vinaya. So there's the rudimentary Buddhist ethics of the Eightfold Path, and then there is development of that through Buddhist history, and including the rules for the monks and nuns. Now, the second part of your question, the Buddha was silent on the question of deities. He did refer to deities. He also referred to demons in terms of tempters. So if you look at, the stories about the Buddha and his personal, the words that have been attributed to him, you could say, you wouldn't want to say that he is an atheist because he makes reference to deity. On the other hand, he doesn't fill out a theology. So Buddhism is not strong in that department.
I will try to make a two-part answer. Number one, the norms are there. The norms are there. The ideals are there. Namely, on the second part, how do we reach that goal? Now we have some differences. Number two, you say, do the Confucian philosophy teaching about so-called kind of supernatural or something like that? Well, in the book of Analects, I wrote one chapter. In Chinese, we say, 未知生，焉知死. In English translation would be, if I do not know about life, about living, how do I know about death? How do I know about the supernatural? So the first thing, my first interest is to know something concrete. Rather here, what are my duties first? In order to know myself, I know this, the living, present existence, and then I won't worry about it. So therefore, you might say the second part is there, whether Confucius simply did not discuss the so-called supernatural elements and so forth. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, audience, for some excellent questions. Of course, we're very happy that Confucius and Buddha could resurrect themselves today to be with us. In all seriousness, Dr. Aloysius Chong and Dr. Michael Meyer, thank you very much for breaking yourself away from your students today so you could be with us. Thank you.